We'll drop you at the mall for a few hours. That was all he said. No explanation, no smile, no attempt to soften the words. My son's voice carried that casual edge people use when brushing crumbs from a table, a tone that dismissed without intending to sound cruel, but cruel all the same. I sat in the back seat, my handbag resting stiffly on my lap, and looked at the back of his head as he drove. The way his hands gripped the steering wheel told me it was decided, final. I laughed, a brittle sound that barely passed my lips. The mall? I asked. For what? He didn't answer right away. His wife turned her face to the window, pretending to be absorbed by the passing streets. Finally, he said, just to spend some time. We'll pick you up later. I wanted to ask, why not come with me? Why not let me be where you are going? But I swallowed it. I had already learned the sharp sting of pressing too hard. My presence in their lives had become something to be negotiated, tolerated, shifted around like luggage. We reached the curb, and before I could gather my thoughts, my daughter-in-law turned to me with that polite, thin smile. It won't be long. You can have a walk, maybe buy yourself something. Something in me shrank. I opened the door slowly, feeling the rush of hot air as it hit my face. My legs felt heavy as I stepped out, like I was walking into a place I hadn't chosen. I turned back, needing one more word from my son, some sign that this wasn't rejection dressed up as convenience. But his eyes stayed on the road ahead. He gave a short nod, as though to hurry me along. The car door shut behind me with that hollow sound that always makes you feel left out of something. I stood there for a moment, clutching my bag, watching as the car merged back into traffic and disappeared. My reflection caught in the mall's glass doors, a lone figure, small against the brightness inside. I walked in because there was nowhere else to go. The air conditioning wrapped around me, artificial and sharp. The polished floors gleamed, reflecting lights too bright for comfort. I had no plan, no list, no desire to shop. My shoes tapped against the tiles as I wandered past stores filled with things I didn't need. Everywhere I looked, I saw families together. A young couple pushing a stroller, stopping to laugh at the baby's outstretched arms. Two teenagers with their mother, huddled over ice cream cones. A man guiding his elderly father into a chair near the food court, their movements patient, unhurried. I sat down on a bench near the fountain. The sound of the water tried to soothe me, but it only reminded me of the emptiness pooling in my chest. I pressed my hands together tightly in my lap, trying not to show the way my fingers trembled. I told myself I was overreacting. That maybe they had errands, or something private to attend to. But the words my son used, "We'll drop you at the mall," lingered like smoke. They hadn't invited me. They hadn't explained. They had deposited me, like one leaves a bag in a cloakroom. Hours stretched longer in places where you don't belong. I walked slowly through shops, pretending to browse scarves, shoes, kitchenware. Salespeople smiled, asked if I needed help, and I always said no. I wasn't there to buy. I was there because I had nowhere else to be. My phone buzzed once with a message from my son. "We'll come back in a bit." No time. No place. Just a vague promise, like a leash keeping me tethered but not close. I put the phone back in my bag, swallowing down the ache in my throat. I remembered, suddenly, years ago when I used to take him to the mall. When he was small, he would beg for the arcade, for pretzels, for toy cars. I had carried his jacket, his half-eaten snacks, his laughter. Back then, the mall had been a place of delight, of belonging. Today it was a waiting room, and I was the one carried, though no one held me. I tried to keep myself occupied. I bought a cup of tea at the food court, sat at a small table, and stirred it too long. The steam fogged my glasses, and I wiped them with a tissue, blinking at the sight of children tugging at their parents' sleeves. I felt invisible, an observer of lives where I had no part. When I finished, I decided to walk outside. The afternoon had shifted, the sun leaned lower, shadows stretched across the pavement. I stood near the entrance, scanning the road, though I told myself not to. My son had said a few hours. I didn't want to seem impatient, needy. But every car that passed made my heart stir, only to settle heavy again when it wasn't them. And then I saw it. Not their car, but another. A vehicle I recognized, one that belonged to a relative. It slowed, turned into the side street near the banquet hall. My breath caught. That hall. I knew it. Bright banners hung outside announcing an event, a celebration of some sort. I turned my head away quickly, as if not looking would erase the recognition. But my chest tightened. I understood, even if I didn't want to admit it. My son and his wife weren't running errands. They weren't occupied with something private. They were there, at that hall. They had left me at the mall, not by chance, but by design. A part of me wanted to walk there, to see with my own eyes. But my feet stayed rooted. I felt cold despite the summer heat, as though I had been pushed out of a circle I once thought permanent. I sat back on the bench by the entrance, and for the first time in a long while, I allowed myself to feel the full weight of loneliness. It wasn't sharp or sudden. It was quiet, like water filling a glass, until you realize it has reached the brim. People passed by me, their arms full of shopping bags, their faces animated with plans and laughter. I sat still, holding nothing, my face carefully blank. Inside, though, I was unraveling. I thought of calling him. I thought of sending a message, "I know where you are. Why didn't you take me?" But my pride held me back. Or maybe it wasn't pride. Maybe it was something deeper, the fear of hearing an answer I already knew. So I waited. Not for them. For myself. For some strength to rise in me, even in that crowded mall where everyone else seemed to belong. When their car finally pulled up again, headlights cutting through the dusk, I stood slowly. My legs ached from sitting too long. My son waved casually, as if nothing unusual had happened. I smiled as I opened the door, though my heart was splintering. "Did you have a good time?" I asked softly, but not to them. To myself. Testing the sound of my own voice, the shape of my own endurance. And as I sat back in that car, I knew this wasn't just about an afternoon at the mall. It was about something larger, a shift I could no longer ignore. The car moved smoothly through the evening traffic, but inside, I sat stiff and silent. My son talked about the weather, about traffic, about nothing at all. His wife nodded, adding small comments, her voice light and careful, as though we had all spent the afternoon in harmony. They didn't ask what I had done at the mall. They didn't ask if I was tired, if I had enjoyed myself, if I had needed anything. It was as if those hours hadn't existed. I turned my face toward the window, watching the blur of headlights, and kept my thoughts folded inside me. I didn't want to break the fragile silence with questions I already knew the answers to. But my chest was tight, full of unsaid words pressing against my ribs. That night, when I was finally alone in my room, I let myself feel it. The bed felt too large, the sheets cold against my skin. I lay there, staring at the ceiling, replaying the small details, his casual tone, her polite smile, the glance neither of them gave me when I stepped out of the car. The memory of that hall, bright and loud, lingered. I had seen the banners, the parking lot filling with cars. I had seen enough to know. Sleep did not come easily. I rose at midnight, boiled water, made tea. The steam rose in curls from the cup, but I barely tasted it. I held it just for the warmth, for something solid in my hands. I tried to tell myself stories, maybe they had been invited last minute, maybe they thought I would be uncomfortable, maybe they planned to tell me later. But the truth was there, steady and cruel, they hadn't wanted me there. The next morning, I kept my silence. At breakfast, I asked how their evening had been. My son looked up briefly, chewing toast, and said, "It was fine." His wife poured juice, smiled faintly, and changed the subject. Not once did they mention where they had gone. Not once did they offer explanation. I nodded and smiled as though I believed them. That was the strange thing, how easily one can wear a mask, even when the heart is breaking underneath. Days passed. The routine continued. We spoke of groceries, of work, of neighbors. But underneath the surface, I carried the weight of that day like a stone. It wasn't only about being left at the mall. It was about the quiet message wrapped in the act, you don't belong with us. Not in this part of our lives. The thought followed me when I walked to the park in the mornings. It followed me when I folded laundry, when I cooked small meals for myself. Ordinary things became heavy because they reminded me of what used to be different. When my son was small, he had clung to me. His hands had reached for mine with absolute trust. I remembered birthday parties where I stayed up all night baking cakes, decorating, arranging chairs, making sure his friends felt welcome. I remembered school mornings when I ironed his uniform while he groaned about not wanting to wake up. I remembered sitting in the audience during every recital, clapping louder than anyone else. I remembered the way he once looked at me, as though I was his safe place, his world. That memory hurt now, because the boy who once clung to me had grown into a man who left me at a mall, like an errand he needed to cross off his list. One afternoon, a week later, I was in the kitchen when my phone rang. It was a cousin of mine, her voice bright with cheer. She said she had seen photos online of the celebration at the hall, a family gathering, a birthday, all of them smiling in their best clothes. She mentioned my son and his wife being there, looking lovely, asking casually why I hadn't come. I pressed my fingers into the counter, steadying myself, and managed to say, I wasn't able to. My voice was calm, even cheerful. But when I hung up, my hands shook. So it was true. They hadn't just attended an event. It was family. My family. My relatives had been there, and I had been left behind. I sat down at the table, staring at nothing. My chest felt hollow, my breathing shallow. I wasn't angry in that moment. I was something worse, I was invisible. For days after, I moved like a shadow. My son didn't notice, or maybe he chose not to. He spoke of bills, of work deadlines. His wife asked me to pass the salt, to check if we had onions in the pantry. Life went on, ordinary and unremarkable, but I felt a divide widening with every passing day. At night, I found myself drifting through memories uninvited. My husband, years ago, had told me once that children grow away, that we must prepare ourselves for distance. He had said it gently, with a kind of acceptance I never understood at the time. I had laughed then, shaking my head, insisting that love like ours, between parent and child, would not fade. Now, sitting alone in the kitchen with only the hum of the refrigerator, I wondered if he had been right all along. But there was something else too, not just the ache of being left out, but the faint stirring of something harder to name. A question, perhaps. Or a beginning. I started noticing small things differently. When I passed shop windows, I didn't just glance and walk on. I found myself looking at clothes I liked, not clothes I thought would please someone else. When I bought tea, I chose the flavor I preferred, even if no one else drank it. It was almost nothing, these tiny choices. Yet each one felt like a pebble dropped in water, ripples spreading outward. Still, the wound remained. I couldn't shake the image of that hall, the sound of laughter I had not been allowed to join. It returned when I washed dishes, when I folded towels. It was a bruise that kept being pressed. One afternoon, I walked again to the mall. Not because I needed anything, but because I wanted to face it. The same entrance, the same polished floors. I wandered slowly, but this time, I looked differently. I saw women my age shopping alone, sipping coffee, carrying bags filled with things they had chosen for themselves. They didn't look lonely. They looked steady, purposeful. I sat down by the fountain again, listening to the water. My reflection shimmered in the pool, older, lined, tired. But there was something else too, a question in my eyes, as though asking myself, what now? That question stayed with me as I left the mall and walked home. It was quiet, but insistent. And perhaps, I thought, it was the beginning of an answer. It is one thing to suspect. It is another to know. For days I lived in that space between, telling myself I could be mistaken, that perhaps I had misread the banners outside that hall, that my cousin's casual words were nothing more than small talk. But somewhere inside me, I knew the truth was sitting like a stone at the bottom of a pond. You can skim water, you can distract yourself with ripples, but the stone remains. The moment of confirmation came quietly. No drama, no confrontation. Just a simple slip of honesty from someone who did not mean harm. It was a Saturday morning, one of those slow ones when the air feels heavy with weekend idleness. I was watering the plants on the balcony when my neighbor's daughter leaned over from the adjoining flat. She is young, maybe 12, and she speaks with the unfiltered directness of children. "Auntie," she said brightly, "I saw your son and his wife at the party last week. It was so big. There was cake and music. Why didn't you go?" Her words were like a hand pulling away a curtain I had been clinging to. For a moment, I couldn't speak. The watering can tilted in my hand, water spilling over the soil, soaking my slippers. I managed a smile. "I wasn't able to go," I said, keeping my voice light. She nodded, satisfied, and began talking about her homework. I kept smiling, but inside I was unraveling. Later that day, when I was alone, I sat with my phone and searched. My hands shook as I scrolled through social media. And there it was, photo after photo, posted by relatives, tagged with laughter and celebration. My son stood tall, smiling broadly, his arm around his wife. Behind them, the hall I had seen from the mall entrance. My cousins, my nieces, my nephews, all of them gathered. Cake, music, speeches. Family. I looked at those photos for a long time, my thumb hovering over each one. The captions stung more than the images. A beautiful evening with family. So much love all around. Words that felt like they were written for everyone but me. No one had thought to invite me. No one had thought to mention me. I wasn't even in the background of a single photo. I had not only been excluded, I had been erased. I locked the phone, set it down, and sat at the kitchen table. The clock ticked on the wall, steady and indifferent. I folded my hands together tightly, because they were trembling. I thought of them all again, the way they had dropped me off with polite excuses, the way I had wandered like a ghost through stores filled with strangers. All along, they had been here, smiling, celebrating, posing for photos. My place had been the bench by the fountain, the lukewarm tea, the long wait for a car that eventually came back as though nothing had happened. For the first time in years, I felt tears rise unbidden. Not the soft tears of nostalgia or sentiment, but sharp, hot tears that made my throat ache. I pressed my hands to my face, ashamed of them even though no one could see me. I cried not only for that day, but for everything that it revealed. For the years of giving, of loving, of believing that blood and sacrifice built unshakable bonds. For the quiet truth that sometimes, no matter what you pour into someone, they can choose to shut the door anyway. When the tears subsided, I sat there, drained and hollow. But in that hollowness, something shifted. Pain does that, it strips you down until only the barest part of you remains. And in that raw place, questions begin to form. Why am I waiting for them to choose me? Why does my worth hang on whether they open the door or leave it shut? The questions startled me. For so long, my life had been arranged around my family, my son, his happiness. It had felt natural, unquestioned. But now, with the sharp sting of being excluded, I saw the truth. I had been waiting for invitations, for crumbs of belonging, instead of choosing myself. That night, I couldn't eat. I lay in bed, the room dark, the air heavy. I thought of the hall again, the way it had glowed with lights. I imagined the sound of music drifting out, the laughter spilling into the street. I pictured my son smiling, cutting cake, his wife clapping beside him. And I pictured myself, not there, never considered, sitting under fluorescent lights at a mall, watching strangers carry shopping bags. But alongside the ache, another image formed. Of me, years ago, standing in front of a classroom, reading aloud a poem when I was a girl. I remembered how my voice had trembled, how my teacher had smiled and said, "You have strength you don't even know yet." I had forgotten that girl. She had been buried under years of motherhood, duty, sacrifice. But she was still there, somewhere. The next morning, I did something small but new. I went to the market and bought myself a scarf. Not practical, not plain, but bright, deep blue with silver threads. I wrapped it around my shoulders and looked at myself in the mirror. For a moment, I didn't look like the invisible figure on a mall bench. I looked like someone who still had color left in her life. My son noticed later. "New scarf?" he asked, glancing at me briefly before returning to his phone. "Yes," I said simply. I didn't explain. I didn't need to. It was a small thing, but it mattered. It was the first thread of something new, something just mine. Still, the wound was there. At dinner that night, I listened to them talk about plans, about people, about events I wasn't included in. I chewed quietly, smiling when required, nodding at the right moments. But beneath the surface, I knew the tide had shifted. Because once you see the truth, you cannot unsee it. Once you know where they really went, you can never again believe the mall was for your sake. And that knowledge, painful as it was, became the beginning of something I hadn't expected, the thought that perhaps, just perhaps, I no longer needed to wait for their invitation to live. I began to notice silence in new ways. Not the peaceful kind that comes when the world rests, but the kind that presses against your skin, reminding you of what is missing. At the dinner table, my son and his wife talked about their week, the errands, the phone calls. Their words moved around me like water flowing around a rock, never quite touching me. I nodded when required, smiled faintly, lifted my fork. But my chest felt tight, as though each bite had to pass through a knot in my throat. That evening, after they went to their room, I sat alone in the living room. The lights from the street spilled through the curtains in pale stripes. On the table, a pile of folded laundry sat waiting to be put away. I looked at it for a long time and realized I didn't have the strength to move. It wasn't the laundry itself, it was everything behind it, the years of doing, serving, arranging, filling spaces so others could be comfortable. I pressed my hands to my knees and whispered aloud, "I am so tired." The sound startled me. My voice was hoarse, as if the words had been waiting for years. That night I dreamed of my husband. He was sitting in his chair, newspaper folded in his lap, looking at me with that calm, steady gaze he always had. In the dream he didn't speak, but I woke with the sense that he had asked me something. "Why are you still waiting at the door?" I carried that question with me all day. Waiting, that had been my posture for months, maybe years. Waiting for an invitation, a gesture, a word that said I was still wanted. But each time, what came instead was dismissal, polite or otherwise. The breaking point came not in some grand moment, but in a small, ordinary one. My son and his wife were preparing to leave for another outing. I stood in the hallway, holding my bag out of habit, expecting to be asked. He glanced at me, then at his wife, and said softly, "Maybe you'll be more comfortable staying back today." I froze. The words were gentle, almost considerate, but the message struck like a blade. More comfortable staying back. As though my absence was comfort. As though my presence was weight. I nodded, forcing a smile. "Of course," I said. The door closed, their voices fading down the corridor. I stood in the quiet apartment, bag still in my hand, and felt something inside me collapse. My knees weakened, and I sat on the edge of the sofa, pressing my face into my palms. The tears came again, but this time they weren't sharp. They were slow, heavy, dragging through me like a river carving its way through stone. I cried for everything, for the girl who once believed love was unshakable, for the woman who had given and given, for the mother who now sat alone with no place at her son's table. I let the tears come until there were no more. When I lifted my head, the room looked the same: furniture, curtains, the folded laundry, but something in me had shifted. The collapse had left behind not just emptiness, but space. For the first time in a long while, I asked myself not, why did they leave me out? But what do I want for myself? The question startled me. For so long, my desires had been tied to others, to my son's success, his happiness, his family. My wants had been absorbed into theirs, invisible even to me. But now, in that raw silence, the question rang clear. I stood, walked to the mirror in the hallway, and looked at myself. My eyes were swollen, my face lined, but behind the weariness, I saw something else. A flicker. The faintest outline of the girl who once stood in front of her class, trembling but proud. The woman who once believed she had strength. I touched the scarf around my shoulders, the one I had bought for myself. The fabric was soft, cool against my skin. It felt like a promise, small but steady. The days that followed were fragile, but different. I began to do small things without asking or waiting. I went for walks in the morning and took the longer path, past the park, where sunlight filtered through the trees. I sat on benches alone, watching children play, and instead of aching for what was lost, I tried to simply see what was. I stopped cooking large meals when they went out. Instead, I made what I liked: a simple soup, a plate of fruit, toast with butter melting into it. Eating alone no longer felt like punishment. It felt like a pause. But the hurt was still there, sharp at the edges. When relatives called, I answered politely, careful not to let the crack in my voice show. I deflected their questions, laughed when they mentioned gatherings. And when I hung up, I sat in the quiet again, feeling both stronger and lonelier. One evening, I passed by the hall again. The banners were gone, the lights dim. The building stood ordinary, silent, as though it had never held laughter or betrayal. I paused on the sidewalk, staring at the empty entrance. I thought of going inside, just to see it, but I didn't. Instead, I turned away, wrapped the blue scarf tighter around my shoulders, and walked on. Each step felt heavier than the last, but also deliberate, as though I was choosing my own direction. That night, my son mentioned casually that they would be out the following weekend. He said it with the same ease one speaks of the weather. I nodded, smiling faintly, but inside, I was already planning something different. I didn't know what yet. But I knew it would not involve waiting by the door. Because that was the breaking point, not the tears, not the silence, not even the exclusion. The breaking point was realizing that I had allowed myself to stand at the threshold of someone else's life, waiting endlessly, instead of stepping into my own. And once that truth sank in, there was no going back. The weekend came, and true to his word, my son announced they would be out. His tone was casual, almost relieved, as though preemptively excusing me from a duty I hadn't asked for. I smiled, nodded, and asked nothing further. When the door closed behind them, the silence didn't sting the way it once had. Instead, it stretched wide before me, open and waiting. I stood in the kitchen, staring at the clock. In the past, I might have filled the hours with chores, tidying drawers no one opened, scrubbing counters that were already clean. But that morning, I reached for my bag and slipped on my shoes. I had nowhere specific to go, but that in itself was the point. I walked to the bus stop. The air was warm, carrying the scent of bread from the bakery nearby. I bought a ticket without hesitation, the small slip of paper feeling oddly significant in my hand. When the bus arrived, I climbed aboard, choosing a seat by the window. As the city rolled past, I realized I hadn't done this in years, traveled alone with no destination but my own choosing. There was a lightness in it, a strange exhilaration, as though I had rediscovered something I had forgotten was mine. I got off near the old marketplace, a place I hadn't visited since my husband was alive. The stalls were still crowded, voices rising and falling in bargaining calls. I walked slowly, touching fabrics, inhaling the spice-laden air. A vendor smiled at me, pressing a ripe peach into my hand. I bought two, slipping them into my bag, feeling the weight of them like proof that I could choose for myself. At a small corner cafe, I stopped. The tables were chipped, the umbrellas faded, but the smell of coffee drifted warm and inviting. I ordered a cup and sat alone, sipping slowly, letting the bitter edge settle on my tongue. Around me, people talked, laughed, scrolled on their phones. No one looked at me, and for the first time, I didn't mind. I opened a notebook I had carried, blank pages waiting. My hand hovered over the pen, uncertain. What would I write? Shopping lists? Memories? Complaints? But instead, I wrote a single line, I am still here. The words startled me. They looked bold against the page, firmer than I felt. But as I stared at them, something loosened in my chest. The afternoon drifted by in small, quiet choices. I walked through the park, watching children race bicycles, old men play chess under trees. I bought myself a book from a second-hand stall, a collection of poems, its cover worn but its words still intact. I carried it home, tucked against my side like a secret gift. When my son and his wife returned later that evening, they found me sitting in the living room, reading. He looked briefly surprised. You went out? Yes, I said simply, not offering details. My voice was calm, steady. That's good, he murmured, before retreating to his room. It was a small exchange, but I felt the shift. I was no longer waiting by the door, no longer arranged around their comings and goings. I had gone out, chosen, lived. And though they barely noticed, I noticed. That was enough. In the days that followed, I began to build a rhythm. Morning walks became routine, not just for exercise, but for the pleasure of watching sunlight scatter across leaves. I discovered a small library branch nearby and got myself a card. The librarian, a woman with kind eyes, recommended novels, and I found myself losing hours in their pages. I began cooking dishes I liked, experimenting with spices my son disliked but I enjoyed. One evening, I made a lentil curry rich with garlic and cumin. The kitchen filled with a scent that was mine alone. When I sat down to eat, I savored each bite slowly, no longer apologizing even in my own mind for the difference. Sometimes I still thought of that hall, of the laughter that had excluded me. The memory would prick unexpectedly, like touching a scar. But alongside the ache came something new, a strange gratitude. Because without that wound, I might never have asked myself what I wanted. I might never have stepped onto that bus, written those words in a notebook, or tasted freedom in a simple peach. One afternoon, while browsing the library shelves, I overheard a group of women my age discussing a community art class. They laughed, comparing their messy attempts at painting. For a moment I hesitated, the old voice rising, "You don't belong, don't intrude." But then another voice, quieter but firmer, said, "Why not?" That evening, I asked the librarian about it. She smiled, gave me a flyer. The class met every Wednesday in a small studio 2 blocks away. The first time I went, I nearly turned back at the door. But I forced myself inside. The room smelled of turpentine and chalk. Brushes and paints lay scattered across tables. The teacher, a woman with streaks of gray in her hair, welcomed me warmly. I sat at a corner table, canvas blank before me. My hands trembled as I dipped the brush into color. But as the bristles touched the surface, something loosened inside me. The lines were uneven, the colors too bright, but I felt alive in a way I hadn't in years. Each week, I returned. Slowly, I began to make acquaintances, women who asked my name, who shared their paints, who laughed when our attempts went awry. Their warmth was casual, uncalculated, and it felt like stepping into sunlight after a long winter. At home, I didn't mention the class. It wasn't secrecy, exactly. It was privacy. A part of my life that belonged only to me. And with each small step, I felt the weight of that mall afternoon lesson. Not disappear, it would never fully disappear, but soften, fade into the background of something larger. One evening, I sat on the balcony, the blue scarf around my shoulders, my notebook open. The city hummed below, lights flickering like scattered stars. I wrote again, they left me at the mall. But I walked out on my own. Reading the words, I felt both ache and strength. Because in truth, that moment of exclusion had not been the end of me. It had been the beginning. I closed the notebook and sat quietly, the night air cool against my face. Inside, my son's laughter drifted faintly from the living room, where he and his wife watched television. But I didn't ache for it anymore. Their laughter was theirs. I had begun to find my own. The days grew warmer as summer leaned into its height. Life settled into its rhythms again, but I had changed the way I moved through them. My mornings belonged to me now, walks in the park, a stop at the library, sometimes an extra half hour at the cafe where the barista already knew I preferred my coffee strong and without sugar. Evenings I painted, the smell of turpentine lingering on my fingers, my notebooks filling with words I hadn't known were waiting to be written. But the memory of that afternoon at the mall never quite left me. It rose in odd places, in the hush of the food court, in the sight of other families walking together, in the way my son's car keys jingled when he reached for them. It was like a stone in my pocket, always there, sometimes heavier, sometimes lighter, but never gone. One Saturday, months after that first wound, it happened again. He picked up his jacket, his wife adjusting her earrings, and he said almost absent-mindedly, "We'll be gone a few hours. Do you want us to drop you somewhere?" The words struck familiar, too familiar. A chill ran through me, the echo of that first afternoon, the sting of being deposited at the mall while they drove off to somewhere brighter. I looked at him calmly. "No," I said, voice steady. "I have my own plans." He blinked, surprised. "Oh. Where to?" "Nowhere you need to worry about," I answered, not unkindly, but firm. There was a flicker in his expression, confusion, perhaps, or curiosity. But he didn't press. They left, and the door clicked shut behind them. I stood for a moment in the quiet hallway, bag already slung over my shoulder. My heart beat quickly, not from fear, but from something sharper, cleaner. I was not waiting for them to decide where I would be. I was walking out on my own terms. I took the bus again, but this time I didn't go to the market or the cafe. I went to the very place where it had all begun, the mall. The automatic doors whooshed open, cool air rushing over me. I walked slowly through the familiar corridors, past the fountain, past the stores. But the place no longer felt like a cage of rejection. It felt like a marker, a point on a map where I had been dropped, left behind, and where I had quietly decided not to stay. I bought myself a cup of tea again, the same spot as before. But this time, I stirred it slowly, savoring it. The waiting that had once felt endless was gone. I wasn't waiting for anyone to return. I wasn't tethered. When I finished, I walked outside. The sun was lowering, gold spilling across the pavement. Across the street, the banquet hall stood quiet, banners long gone, windows dark. I looked at it without flinching. For months, that hall had been a wound in my memory. But standing there now, scarf around my shoulders, bag at my side, I felt no pull. No ache. Only the simple truth, life had gone on, with or without me, and so had I. I walked past it deliberately, my steps steady. Each footfall felt like closure, not in words, not in confrontation, but in action. Later that evening, when I returned home, my son asked casually, "Did you do anything today?" "Yes," I said, hanging my scarf neatly. "I went out." "Where?" he asked. "Nowhere important," I replied, smiling softly. He looked at me, puzzled, as though trying to read something in my tone. But I didn't explain. I no longer needed to. Because the truth was clear to me now. I had spent too long waiting for a place at someone else's table, longing for their acknowledgement, their invitation. But the mall, the hall, the long silent evenings, they had taught me something I should have known long ago. I did not need to be chosen to exist. I did not need to be invited to belong. I belonged, simply because I was still here. That night, I opened my notebook once more. On a clean page, I wrote, "They may drop me anywhere, but I will always know how to walk out on my own." I closed the book gently, turned off the light, and sat in the quiet. Not the heavy silence of exclusion, but the calm silence of someone who has reclaimed herself. The memory of that first afternoon at the mall no longer burned. It was part of me, yes, a scar, a lesson, but no longer the whole of me. And as I lay in bed, listening to the faint hum of the city, I felt it at last, not bitterness, not grief, but a quiet strength. Because sometimes the cruelest dismissal becomes the beginning of freedom. And sometimes the words that once wounded you, "will drop you at the mall for a few hours," become the very reason you finally remember how to stand, how to walk, and how to live again.